Hi, I'm Simon K. Jones, and you're listening to the audio version of Tales from the Triverse, my weekly ongoing serial. This is Gods and Robots, Part 7. Beyond the Brulian Wastes, Palinor, 3208, Bright Sun. Rumbling spread from an epicentre on the edge of the Brulian Wastes, the flat land that lay beyond the canyons and mazes, after they had diminished into the ground. It began as a tremble underfoot, a vibration that might have been a stampeding herd of animals, or the trundling wheels of a nearby caravan. Growing from there, it became apparent to anyone in the vicinity that it was not a local phenomenon, but something spread far wider. Birds took to the skies, launching away from the ground and the trees. The lone river that emerged from the wastes vibrated with ripples, which became freshwater waves. The dust of the plains kicked up into the air, a haze forming across a diameter tens of miles across. They felt it in Brulia, even while being murdered by the alien ship. They felt it on the trade routes, as canyon walls cracked and collapsed, rocks falling and crushing market tents. On her rocking chair beside a fire, a strong, resolute woman known as Jacinda watched as her carts were destroyed, her pack animals panicking and breaking loose, only to be battered to death. The sun had blinked out for a handful of apocalyptic seconds, and the planet had trembled. She could issue orders, but she'd worked and travelled those routes long enough to know a cliff collapse, and that there was no time to get clear. The light had returned at least, and she sipped on her cocktail, grimacing at the layer of dust that had settled on its surface, and didn't feel a thing as the canyon came down upon her and her crew. They felt it at the peak, the settlement that had spent centuries wrapping itself around the ragged curve of the soul-incongruous mountain that thrust up from the plains. The more recent structures, flimsier builds with insufficient supports beneath the balconies and platforms, simply collapsed and vanished into the mists and snow below, taking with them the cries of anyone inside. Along the wooden walkways and bridges raced the people of the peak, who were used to a difficult life and the perils of living on the side of a sheer mountain. There had been earthquakes and storms, but nothing like this. The mountain shook, and entire streets fractured and tumbled, beginning the long fall to the plains far below. Cracks formed in the stone itself, splintering lines that snaked and multiplied, cutting deep grooves. A traveller felt it as they hurried their horse and cart across the plains, following the path south. They had cannily departed Brulia before the fighting began, sensing a change was coming. They'd always had good instincts for knowing when it was time to move on. The tremors worsened, and they were thrown from their saddle into the dirt. A dark line spread from the horizon, cutting its way along the road. As it got closer, the trader realised it was the ground opening up, splitting in half and falling away in both directions, as if torn asunder by invisible hands, liquefying to an undulating, sucking quicksand. The world itself rendered in two, a noise so cacophonous that he feared his ears would bleed. The traveller's last thought, as the ground dropped away and they fell into the chasm, was, "There's something coming out." The rupture spread from the epicentre, and from the boiling sands emerged first a hand, clawing its way out and gripping the landscape, then another, and the fingers tore into the rock. A huge dust storm whipped across the plains, flickers of electricity arcing within, billowing half a mile into the sky. Through the maelstrom, a shadow could be seen, dragging itself free of the crack. Its every movement prompted another rumble in the surface of the world, its enormity displacing the dust clouds and sending their gale winds rushing across the plains. Emerging from the storm stepped a titan, an old god risen from beneath, blinking in the daylight for the first time in 1,000 years. A crust of rock and earth fell from its body as it moved, revealing an iridescent skin that refused to settle on a particular colour. A glowing crown hovered above its head, a star sigil floating behind its shoulders. Across the plains, the townspeople of the peak witnessed the return of Unihex, the cosmic hand and the god of space and time. The religious among them dropped to their knees, in recognition of the giant's shape from legend and ancient texts. The rest stared or tried to flee in terror. Unihex, the missing god, withdrawn from the world a millennia prior, but always thought to be manipulating Palinor from his slumbering place in the core of the planet. Unihex's word had faltered, become silent, 2 centuries earlier, at the moment of the joining, when Cainamor had opened the Triverse. Followers of Unihex's teachings had rightly considered it a desperately ill omen. Breathing the free air, Unihex considered his surroundings. The coast to the west, the tropics to the south, the wastes to the north, and the black speck looming above Brulia, raining torment on his people. Each stride took him closer to the peak. Those who had left at the first rumblings had a slim chance at survival. Anyone who had lingered, who had dithered, did not. Many stories were told of the peak, of its abrupt incline, its tapered summit, its incongruous position as the only mountain on the plains. Some had said it was the finger of an enormous hand, reaching up from deep below. Others thought it the tail of an ancient sealed dragon. And there were those who referred to it as the blade of Unihex. As he approached, he grew yet taller, his size and shape shifting imperceptibly. Out on the plains there was no reference, no size comparison. Standing beside the peak, a mountain several thousand feet in height, the scale was inescapable. Unihex reached out and thrust his hand deep into the mountain, crumpling its slopes like they were made from paper. Avalanches cascaded down the mountain, the inhabitants of the elevated town buried as they fell. Still he reached, a look of concentration on his beautiful face, and then there was a smile. His arm tensed, and he pulled, the mountain erupting in all directions, melting under the intense friction, and the shockwave spewing out a pyroclastic torrent and projecting arcing magma globs that ploughed into the ground far below. Withdrawing from the collapsing mountain, unconcerned by the devastation, Unihex pulled free his ancient weapon, Palin, the shining blade, which had sliced at the sun 1,000,000 times, until the universe was speckled with stars. It was almost as impossibly tall as the god. As he moved it through the air, contrails formed in its wake, as the heat and minerals of the mountain cooled in the high-altitude, frigid air. Unihex turned his attention to Brulia, sat below the horizon on the far side of the wastes. It was the time of blood and toil, and a reckoning was demanded. As he began his walk, he was joined by others, Glacius, the god of illusion, artificially projecting themselves in the image of a woman of equal stature to Unihex, clad in flowing white robes. Illumet, god of elements, gliding over the plains, conjuring a violent storm in his wake. The tiny god, Paf, unassuming, praying for miracles. The 4 spoke not a word, despite it being the first time they had all been together for many ages. Unihex dragged his sword along the surface of the planet, tearing it asunder, remembering the carving of the canyons and the mazes of the Brulian wastes. Unihex dragged his sword along the surface of the planet, tearing it asunder, remembering the carving of the canyons and mazes of the Brulian wastes. As he scraped at the soil and rock, so he channeled the planet's energies. There had been a time when the 4 of them had commanded followings in the millions, had summoned pilgrimages from across the continent and beyond. All of time and space had been theirs with which to play. The diminishing had begun with the arrival of the humans, then accelerated with the opening of the portals. The churches still stood, but were often filled with tourists. They would be made to believe again, first with the banishing of the abomination above Brulia. Swinging the sword around to rest on his shoulder, Unihex took another deep breath of air, marvelling at its scent. Much had changed during his slumber, and much needed correcting. Thanks for listening. You can leave comments, find more, subscribe, all that kind of stuff over at simonkjones.substack.com.